Orchestrated entirely original story with new characters, setting, and scheme mechanics. Orchestrated entirely original story with new characters, setting, and scheme mechanics. The first thing that told me something was wrong was a strip of pink survey ribbon tied to my own fence post out by the cattle gate, and I knew for a fact I hadn't put it there. I spent 38 years as a land surveyor in this county. I retired at 66 and I'm 71 now, so that's a long time walking other people's property lines in the heat and the briars, finding corners that hadn't been touched since the Eisenhower administration, settling arguments between neighbors who'd been mad at each other since before either of them was born. You learn to read the ground. You learn that a fence will lie to you, and a deed will lie to you sometimes too, but a monument set in the dirt by a man who knew what he was doing will tell you the truth if you're patient enough to find it. So when I saw that ribbon, the kind we use to flag a line before we run it, my stomach did something I didn't have a word for yet. I walked to the fence that morning the way I'd warped it 10,000 times, except this time I was reading it. There was a fresh wooden lath driven near the northeast corner, and a little ways off, half hidden in the broom sedge, a flag marking what looked like the start of a traverse. Somebody had been out here with a transit, on my land. 41 acres my wife and I bought in 1979 with money we didn't really have, where we raised our daughter and buried 2 dogs and 1 very stubborn pony, where I built the workshop with my own hands and Vivian planted the line of dogwoods that still bloom every spring like she's checking in. Vivian passed 2 years ago this past March. Pancreatic. It was fast, which everybody tells you is a mercy, and I suppose it is, but a mercy still leaves you standing in a kitchen at 5 in the morning not knowing what to do with your hands. I mention her because you can't understand what came after without understanding that I was a man with a hole in the middle of him. And a hole is a thing other people can pour things into if they're so inclined. I didn't pull up the flags. That was the first decision I made, and it turned out to be the right one. I'm a careful man by trade. You don't grab the first thing you see and yank on it. You stand back and you figure out where the line is coming from and where it's headed before you put your hand on anything. So I left the ribbon where it was, walked back to the house, made my coffee, and sat at the table where Vivian used to sit, and I thought, here is what I already knew sitting there. My daughter had been coming around a lot more in the last 8 or 9 months. That sounds like a good thing. It started feeling like a good thing. She'd call on a Tuesday and just drop by Wednesday with a casserole, ask how I was sleeping, whether I was eating, whether I'd remembered to take the blood pressure pill the doctor put me on after Vivian died. Her husband started coming with her more, and her husband and I had never been what you'd call close. He does financial planning, has an office in a strip mall 2 towns over with his name on the glass and a leather chair he's very proud of. He'd taken to calling me Pop, which he'd never done in 15 years of marriage to my girl, and he'd started asking about the land. Casual at first. What did I figure it was worth now? Wasn't it a lot to keep up at my age? Had I thought about what happens to it down the road? I'd told him the truth, which was that I'd thought about it plenty. That it was going into a trust for my granddaughter when I got around to seeing a lawyer about it, and that I had no intention of selling so much as a square foot of it while I was breathing. He'd smiled and said that was real smart, Pop, real smart. And I remember thinking even then that his smile didn't reach his eyes. But I let it go. He was my daughter's husband. You let things go for the people you love, even the ones you love by marriage. The granddaughter is named Josie. She's 11. She is the best thing in my life and the only one of them who comes out here just to be here. Who'll spend a whole Saturday with me in the workshop sanding a board down to nothing for no reason except she likes how it feels. The land was always for her. I want that understood. So I sat at the table with my coffee going cold and I tried to make the pieces fit. A survey nobody had told me about. A son-in-law who suddenly cared what my acreage was worth. A daughter asking 3 times a week if I was confused. And I'm not a paranoid man. I want to say that plainly because what I'm about to tell you sounds like a paranoid man's story. And I have asked myself 100 times whether I imagined the whole thing into being. I didn't. I'll get to how I know. That afternoon, I drove into town to the county recorder's office. I've known the woman who works the deed room for 30 years. I've pulled 1,000 plats across that counter. I asked her, real friendly, whether anything had come across on my parcel lately, any survey filed, any lien, anything at all. She looked it up. There was a preliminary plat on file, submitted 3 weeks before, showing my 41 acres carved into 19 residential lots and a cul-de-sac, with a name across the top I'd seen on signs out by the interstate, a development outfit building those vinyl subdivisions where every house is the same house. The surveyor of record wasn't me, obviously, but the party who'd commissioned the work, listed right there on the paperwork, was a company I'd never heard of. And when I wrote the name down and looked it up that night, it was an LLC registered 4 months earlier to my son-in-law's office address. I sat with that a long while. My own daughter's husband had hired a man to survey my land for a subdivision, on my land without my knowledge, while I was still alive and still holding the deed. You'd think the next thing I felt was rage. It wasn't. It was a kind of cold quiet, the way it gets in your head when you're standing in the middle of a botched job and you finally see the one mistake that everything else hangs on. I've felt that quiet a few times in my life. It's not panic. It's the opposite of panic. It's the moment the work becomes clear. I called an old friend named Wes. Wes and I came up together. He ran a backhoe and read prints back when I was setting stakes, and somewhere in his 40s he went to law school at night and never looked back. He does wills and estates and land now, out of a little office above the hardware store. He's not flashy. He wears the same brown sport coat to every funeral in the county. But there is not a more careful man alive, and when I told him what I'd found, he was quiet for a good while on the phone before he spoke. "Don't pull those flags," he said. "Don't say a word to either of them. And don't sign anything they put in front of you, not a birthday card, not a grocery list, nothing, until you and I have talked face to face." I asked him what he thought they were building toward. A survey doesn't take a man's land. A subdivision plan is just lines on paper if the owner won't sell. "That's exactly right," he said. "Which means they need a way to sell it without you. And there's really only one way to do that to a man who won't cooperate." He let that hang there a second. "How's your memory, friend? Honestly, any real trouble?" I told him I'm 71. I forget where I set my reading glasses. I walked into the feed store last month and stood there a second trying to recall what I came for. The ordinary stuff. "Good," Wes said. "Nothing a jury would call decline. That gives us room." And then he told me to come to his office Monday and to act, in the meantime, like a man who suspected nothing at all. That weekend, my daughter came out with a pot roast and her husband in tow, and I want you to know I performed for them, sitting at my own table, and it was the loneliest acting I've ever done. He asked over dinner whether I'd given any more thought to simplifying things. She asked twice whether I'd been remembering to eat. At one point, she set her hand over mine, soft, the way you touch a child, and said, "Daddy, I just worry about you out here all by yourself. You forget things. You don't even hear it when you do it." And I looked at the daughter I'd taught to drive in the church parking lot, the daughter who used to fall asleep on my chest watching ball games. And I said, "I know, sweetheart. I know I'm not what I was." And I watched something flicker across her husband's face that I can only call satisfaction. And I understood that I had just handed them exactly what they came for. Monday, I sat across Wes's desk and he laid it out the way you'd lay out a survey, from the known corner outward. What they were after was a guardianship. In this state, if family can convince a court that an older person can't manage his own affairs, can't remember, can't reason, can't be trusted to handle money or property, they can petition to have a guardian and a conservator appointed. That person then controls everything. The accounts, the house, the land. Sign here, the new guardian can. Sell there, the new guardian can. The old man's wishes stop mattering in the eyes of the law. It is faster than waiting for me to die, and it does not require me to agree. They need 3 things, Wes said, counting on his fingers, calloused even now. They need a doctor to say you've lost capacity. They need a record of you acting confused, which is why your daughter's been narrating it back to you, getting you to agree you're slipping, probably writing it down. And they need the court to move before you can mount a defense, because a guardianship hearing on an old widower with a fresh death in the family and a cooperative-looking petition can go through fast. I asked him if they could really find a doctor to lie. Wes said they wouldn't even need one to lie necessarily. They'd need one willing to write what they wanted. There's always somebody, he said. And he was right, as it turned out. But I'll come to that. Then I asked him the question that had been sitting on my chest since the deed room. Was I allowed to fight this dirty? Because what was forming in my head was not clean. Wes leaned back. Here's what you need to understand, he said. You're not allowed to entrap anybody. You can't talk somebody into a crime they weren't already committing. But that's not what's happening here. They started this. The survey, the LLC, the petition they're building. All you'd be doing is letting them keep walking the road they're already on and writing down what you see. In this state, you can record any conversation you're a party to. You can put a camera in your own home. None of that is a trap in the legal sense. It's a record, and a record, he said, and here the old surveyor in him came out, is the only thing that holds up when 2 people remember the line differently. So we made a plan, and the plan had patience in it which suited me. For the next 3 weeks I became, on the surface, exactly the man they needed me to be. I want to tell you it felt clever. It didn't. It felt like grieving twice. I'd get my daughter on the phone and I'd let my voice wander. I'd say, "Now what day did you say you were coming, honey?" I'd it written down somewhere. I'd mention a doctor's appointment I didn't have. I'd ask her, sounding worried, whether the power bill was the one I'd already paid or the one I still owed. When I knew good and well I'd paid it because I pay it the first of every month the way I've done since 1971. Little wobbles. Nothing dramatic. Just enough water under the door to make a worried child feel her worry confirmed. And while I did that, I watched. I noticed her start taking notes on her phone after our calls. I noticed her husband come out one afternoon to fix a sticky window and spend 20 minutes in my back office, where I keep my files, and I noticed afterward that my folders weren't sitting the way I leave them, which a careless man wouldn't catch, but a man who has organized field notes for 40 years catches every time. I let him look. There was nothing in that cabinet that mattered. The things that mattered were already at Wes's office. About 2 weeks in, my daughter brought up, gentle as anything, that there was a doctor she'd found, a specialist in senior cognitive wellness, and wouldn't it be a good idea, just for peace of mind, for me to go get evaluated? I said maybe, I supposed, if she thought so. I went home and called Wes and told him the doctor's name, which I'd written on the back of my hand. It was a man called Mercer. Wes called me back the next day and there was iron in his voice. Mercer had given up a medical license in another state 4 years ago, ahead of a board investigation into signing off on disability and capacity paperwork he'd never properly done. He had no active license in ours. He was, for all the law cared, a man with a printer and a signature. And the appointment my daughter wanted to set up wasn't an appointment so much as a formality, somebody to put their name to a letter that was, as Wes put it, already written. Then Wes told me the part that took the floor out from under me. He pulled the court records that morning. The petition was already filed 3 days before, asking for an emergency hearing to appoint a guardian, on the grounds that I, a widower in cognitive decline, was at risk of financial harm and could not manage my own property. The petitioner of record was my daughter. Her husband had signed on as the interested party who would conveniently serve as conservator of my estate, and attached to it already was a letter on a borrowed letterhead, signed by the man Mercer, describing a patient he had never laid eyes on as suffering significant memory loss and impaired judgment. I drove to Wes's office, and we sat there and he watched me take it in. And I'll tell you the truth, I didn't say anything for a long time. I looked out his window at the courthouse across the square. the courthouse where I'd recorded 1,000 honest plats, and I thought about my daughter at 6 years old standing on my boots while I danced her around the living room to a Patsy Cline record. I thought about walking her down the aisle to the man whose name was now on a piece of paper, trying to take everything Vivian and I ever built. And the thing that rose up in me wasn't hate. I keep coming back to this because it's the truest part. It was grief. I grieved her like she was already gone, because in the way that mattered, she was. "What do we do?" I finally said. Wes said, "We let them think the door's open. And then we let them walk all the way through it, on camera, in front of a notary, telling you to your face what they swore to a court they'd never do. Here is what we did. I called my son-in-law myself, which I knew would please him. The old man reaching out, finally seeing reason. I told him I'd been thinking, and that I was tired, and that maybe he was right. Maybe it was time to let somebody help me with all of it before I made some mess of it I couldn't fix. I let my voice get small. I said I trusted him more than I trusted myself these days. I heard him soften and warm right up, the way a man does when he thinks he's won. I asked if he could come out Saturday and help me sign whatever needed signing so I could stop worrying about it. He said he'd bring everything. He said he'd bring a notary even, to make it easy on me. I said that sounded fine. I said, I just want it done right, son. I have never in my life worked so hard to keep my voice even. Then I went to work, because that's what I'm good at. I am a man who has hidden survey markers where developers couldn't find them and run lines through laurel so thick you couldn't see your own boots. Hiding 2 small cameras in my own living room was not a hard job. I set one high in the bookcase, sighted on the dining table where the signing would happen, and one low across the room covering the door and the hall, because you always want 2 angles when you mean to close a traverse without any gaps. I checked the light at the time of day they'd be coming. I checked the sound. I did it the way I do everything, slow and twice. And I left one thing out where it would be found. On the side table by my chair I set a manila folder, worn soft at the edges like I'd been carrying it around fretting over it, and inside it I put a single typed page that looked like a list of my accounts and the land and a safe deposit box at a bank across the county, with a handwritten note in the margin in a shaky version of my own hand. Remember, deed and trust papers in box, key with attorney. There was no box. There was no key like that. There were no papers there. It was bait, plain and simple, and I wanted to see whether he'd take it, because a man who's only worried about his father-in-law's health doesn't photograph a list of his assets. A man building a case to steal does. Saturday morning came clear and cool. My daughter didn't come, and I noted that, the way Wes told me to note everything. Her husband came alone except for the notary, a young fellow he seemed to know, and he came with a leather folio thick with paper. I'd made coffee. We sat at the table where Vivian and I ate 40 years of suppers. He was kind to me. That's the part that still sits in my chest funny. He was gentle and patient, and he called me Pop, and he spread the papers out and he started walking me through them, and every word out of his mouth was a lie told softly. He told me one document was just to let me help with the bills, Pop, so you don't have to worry about due dates. It was a durable power of attorney handing him control of every account I had. He told me another was basically just updating your paperwork to match what the county wants. It was a deed. He had me set to sign my 41 acres, Vivian's dogwoods, Josie's future, over into the LLC he'd registered to his own office, and he sat there and told me it was a tax form. The notary, God help him, kept his eyes on the table. I let him talk. I asked the kind of foggy, trusting questions a confused old man asks. Now this one here, son, this is just for the electric and the water? And he'd say, That's right, Pop, just so I can take care of it for you, and I'd nod. And somewhere above us in the bookcase a little red light was running, and I'd think, Say it again. And he did. He said it 3 or 4 different ways. He told me in my own kitchen, looking at me with what I have to believe he thought was love, that he'd handle everything and I wouldn't have to trouble my head about any of it ever again. At one point he glanced over and saw the folder on the side table. I watched him see it, I watched him drift over while the notary shuffled papers, open it, read it, and slip his phone out to photograph the page. Then he put it back, not quite where it had been, and came and sat down again and slid the deed across to me with a pen. I picked up the pen. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt the loneliest I've ever felt, lonelier than the kitchen at 5 in the morning, because the boy across from me was somebody my daughter chose and somebody my granddaughter calls daddy, and I was about to take a wrecking ball to all of it, and there was no version of the day where I came out of it with a family still whole. So I set the pen down, and I said, in my regular voice, the voice I use to tell a man his fence is 3 feet over the line, I'm not going to sign that. It's not a tax form, it's a deed, and you know it's a deed, and you've known it was a deed, and you've known it was a deed since before you walked in my door. I've never seen a face change so fast. The notary stood up like the chair had shocked him, and I told him, the notary, that he ought to get in his car and go, and that he'd want to think hard about what he'd just sat through, because the sheriff's office already had his name. Which was true. Wes had seen to all of it the week before. Because here is what my son-in-law didn't know, sitting there with his folio and his soft voice. Wes had already taken the whole thing to the county. The survey filed behind my back, the LLC, the guardianship petition, the letter signed by a man with no license, a sworn statement from me, and my medical records from my actual doctor, the one I'd seen the week prior, who'd put in writing that I was a sharp 71-year-old with no cognitive impairment whatsoever. The district attorney's office had been briefed. A detective had been assigned. They'd told Wes to let the signing happen if it was going to happen, because nothing makes a case like a man on video telling you it's a tax form while he hands you a deed to steal your land. They didn't arrest him at my table. It doesn't happen like the television. He left white-faced and shaking and got in his truck, and I sat on my porch and watched him go down the driveway past the dogwoods, and then I went inside and called Wes, and Wes called the detective, and I pulled the 2 little cameras down and handed the footage over Monday morning. They charged him on a Wednesday. Financial exploitation of an elderly person, which is a felony in this state. Forgery, for the doctor's letter procured for the court. Conspiracy, filing a fraudulent instrument. My daughter, whose name was on the petition as the one swearing I'd lost my mind, was charged too. I won't pretend that part was easy to watch. The man Mercer, who'd signed a medical opinion about a patient he'd never met, got handed over to the people who handle the kind of fraud that crosses state lines. And Wes told me later it went very badly for him, which I confess I did not lose sleep over. It moved through the courts over the better part of a year. There were hearings and there were lawyers, and there was an afternoon I sat on a hard bench in the courthouse hallway, the same building where I'd recorded honest work my whole life. And my son-in-law walked past me in a suit and didn't look at me, and my daughter walked past a minute later and did, just for a second, and I have no word for what passed between us. It wasn't anger. It was older and heavier than anger. He took a plea in the end. The guardianship petition was thrown out with prejudice, which means they can't refile it. He lost his license to handle other people's money. The state board pulled it once the conviction came down. And a man in his line of work without that license is a man looking for new work. He got probation, a long one, a fine that hurt, and in order to pay back every dollar he'd spent setting the scheme up, down to the surveyor's invoice. My daughter took a separate plea, a lesser one. Probation, and a stack of community service hours and a record. I asked the DA quietly not to push for jail on her, and they didn't. And I don't entirely know why I did that, except that she stood on my boots once, and I couldn't stop being her father even when she'd given me every reason to. Now I want to tell you the part I'd want somebody to tell me. If I were the one watching this instead of living it. The reason any of it worked, the reason they got as far as they got, is that I had put off doing the boring, unglamorous thing every adult my age needs to do and keeps deciding to do later. I had a will from 1991 that didn't match my life anymore. I had no trust. I had accounts with beneficiary lines I'd never updated. I'd told myself the land would go to Josie, like saying it out loud made it law. It doesn't. Intentions aren't instruments. A wish isn't a deed. After the arrests, Wes and I sat down and did it right, and it took one afternoon, and I'm ashamed it took me until 71 and a near disaster to spend that afternoon. We put the land and the house into a revocable living trust, so that the title is held in a structure that's a great deal harder for anybody to pry me out of. We named a successor I actually trust, an old friend, not a relative, which I'd recommend to anybody whose family situation has gone sideways. We signed a durable power of attorney naming the right person, because a power of attorney is a loaded gun, and you'd best be sure whose hand you're putting it in. We updated every beneficiary line. We wrote down, in plain language, what I want to happen and who is to carry it out. And we filed and recorded what needed filing and recording. If you're older and you own something worth taking, and you have people around you who've started watching it more closely than they watch you, go see a real estate or an elder law attorney, not the fellow who did your speeding ticket. An actual estate attorney. Have the uncomfortable conversation. It is not morbid. It is the most generous thing you can do, because it's the thing that lets you stop bracing and go back to living. I wish I'd understood that the day Vivian and I bought the land instead of the day I almost lost it. People ask me sometimes if I hate him. I don't much, and that surprises people. Hate is a tool that's useful for about 2 days, and then it starts costing you more than it makes. What I carry isn't hate. It's the grief I told you about. The grieving of a daughter I thought I knew, and a version of a family that maybe only ever existed in my head. I don't get to see Josie like I did. That's the cruelest part of the whole business. That the people who tried to steal her future are the ones who control whether I get her on a Saturday. And that's a wound that hasn't closed and maybe won't. We talk on the phone. I keep her board, the one she sanded down to nothing for no reason, on the workbench where I can see it. The dogwoods bloomed again this spring. Vivian's dogwoods. White as anything, the whole line of them lit up some mornings like they were checking in. I kept the land. All 41 acres of it. I had my own crew come out and resurvey it properly in my name and set good monuments at every corner, iron-driven deep where no flag of anybody else's is ever going to confuse the line again. I had my old dog Tucker the whole time through this by fat, useless, beloved hound who slept through every bit of the drama snoring on the porch. Last fall a woman at the feed store had a litter of pups nobody wanted. And there was a runt, half-border collie and half-question mark, who walked across the floor and sat on my boot and looked up at me like she'd been waiting. I named her Maple. She follows me out along the fence line in the mornings now, and Tucker tolerates her, and the two of them sit with me at the northeast corner where this whole thing started, where there's a clean iron monument in the ground now instead of somebody's pink ribbon. I go out there most days at first light before the heat. I run the line in my head the way I used to run it on paper, corner to corner to corner, closing the traverse, checking that it comes back around to where it started, with no error left open. It does. The boundary holds. The land is mine, and someday by paper that means something, it'll be hers, and there is no man with a folio and a soft voice who can take that line away from us now. The sun comes up over Vivian's dogwoods. The dogs settle in the grass, and for the first time in a long while, I sit out there at the corner of everything we built, and I am, if not all the way at peace, then pointed in the right direction. That's about as much as a man my age has any business asking for. The morning I found the ribbon tied to my fence post, I had 2 roads in front of me and didn't even know I was choosing. I could have driven straight to my daughter's house and thrown the whole ugly thing on her kitchen table. That's what most of me wanted. But 40 years of walking property lines taught me something that saved me here. You don't yank on a wire before you know where it's hot. You stand back. You find the source. You stay calm enough to see clearly even when your hands want to shake. That clear-headedness, the plain discipline of looking before I reacted, is the only reason the truth ever came out instead of just my temper. The second thing that carried me was a line I refused to cross. I could have fought my son-in-law the dirty way. I could have forged something of my own, lied to a judge the way they lied about me, fought fire with fire. Wes warned me off it, but the truth is I'd already decided. I wanted to win the way an honest man wins, with a record instead of a lie. Because the day you become the thing you're fighting is the day you've already lost, no matter what the court rules. When Garrett sat at my table and called a deed a tax form, that difference between us was the whole case. He had a scheme. I had the truth and a camera. Truth is patient. A lie has to keep moving or it falls down. And the third thing, the hardest, was simply not quitting. Grief is heavy. I was a widower with a hole in the middle of me. And the people who should have been holding me up were the ones reaching into my pockets. There were nights I wanted to sign whatever they put in front of me just to make the loneliness stop. Staying upright through that, doing the slow, boring work week after week when every part of me wanted to either explode or collapse, took more out of me than any job I ever surveyed. But that's where things actually get decided. Not in the big dramatic moment, in whether you can keep your feet under you long enough to reach it. What I'd want anybody to take from this isn't really about Garrett or the guardianship papers. It's that the people who tried to take everything were betting I'd be too sad, too tired, and too trusting to think straight. They bet on the weakest version of me. The way you beat that bet is to become the steadiest version instead. Honest when it costs you, clear-eyed when you're scared, and stubborn enough to outlast anyone who'd rather you just gave up. Vivian's dogwoods still bloom out front. The land's still ours, and someday it'll be Josie's by paper that means something. I earned that the slow way, and I'd do it the same all over again.